to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
And my friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hello, Curt.
Hey, Pep.
Doing good today?
I am, now that I'm talking to you.
It's great to see you.
Right
we are here today, and we are on episode 9 of this season of the Being Known podcast, and we are going through the book, The Soul of Shame. We are going to be in chapter 8 today, which is titled Redeeming Shame in Our Nurturing Communities.
You weren't really sure if you wanted to name today's episode, were you?
I wasn't positive. I wasn't positive about it. So Curt, this was a great chapter. Excited to hear you talk about this today and talk with you about this chapter. The stories in here are really good, and the information. So let's jump right in.
Yeah. Well, I think we've been talking about this topic of shame and as it exists kind of in our experience, but then also reminding ourselves that our experience is one in which we are embedded in a story, and we all kind of get that. It's just that we often don't pay attention to the story that we're actually in. And one of the most important things for us to discover is that the stories that we live in, not only the story that I live in, but where it is that I actually learn which story that is, right? The place where I learn that I am in a story and what the story is that I'm in are the early places where we learn that are in these, and therefore also the place where evil wants to come and disintegrate and disrupt that storytelling, disrupt the story right from the beginning, just as it did in Genesis. It wants to do that from the beginning. Those stories are told most primally in the earliest places, in those places where we dwell in our early years. That would be our family. And for those of us who are people of faith, it would be in our church. And then at least in our culture, as we are growing up, the places where we spend the most time in the first 2 decades of our lives are in our places of education, where we learn. And in some respects, those 3 places, our family, our churches, and our schools, are the primary, we might say that they're primary learning centers for us. We are learning about the world. And one of the things I would want to highlight is that these are also the places, these are the contexts that we occupy when we are most neuroplastically flexible. So our brains are most flexibly adaptive and able to take on and take in all the messages, all the things that we are taught about the way the world is, and the things that we learn about who we are in those worlds. We are most easily moldable, if you will, in those 3 primary places in which we are nurtured. We call them our nurturing communities. And it's here, before I get really into the text of the book, it's here that I want to just reference the work of someone who I think has demonstrated a hopeful and necessary capacity to help us learn about the story of the Bible. Because what we've said from the beginning is that we believe that we're living in this grand narrative of the biblical narrative, this grand arc. And where do we learn that? We learn that in the Bible. And but I'd have to say that personally, if you were to ask me, well, what's the story that the Bible tells? I might give you the standard line that I would say that, I grew up in an evangelical, and by evangelical, I mean the way it would have been defined in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when it first emerged, not evangelical in the way it now has kind of been hijacked, but an evangelical Protestant community, an evangelical Quaker community. And we had a certain way of understanding that, but I think that the difficulty is for me is that I read the Bible and I read it, whether I know it or not, I read it through the lens of a modern day Westerner.
Hmm.
And so when I read the history of the Bible, I read it the way that we teach ourselves history. When I read was there a real serpent in the garden? Did the sun really stand still for Joshua? I mean, all these, well, that's not possible. So if that's not possible, then where else is the Bible? All these ways of which we have no idea that, like, I'm reading the Bible in a way that the Bible was never intended to be read. No one would ever read Tolstoy or Dorothy Sayers, for example, and just read their stories and say, "Oh, that's a nice story." You know, uh, no one would read The Idiot. No one would read, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, and just say, "Oh, it's a story that stands on its own." No, if you read all of Sayers' work, if you read like she is trying to say something beyond what is just on the pages. And so, even though it's beautiful literature, there's also a purpose for why she's writing it the way she's writing it.
Right.
Like any great movie, like a great movie. And the Bible is above all else like one of the most sophisticated pieces of literature that's ever been written and collected and so forth and so on. And so how we approach it um, is part of why we have so many difficulties today. And I would say that evil wants to use shame even to interrupt the way we read the Bible, how we come to understand even the stories about that. And so Tim Mackey and his colleagues have developed this thing called the Bible Project. And to all of our listeners, I would say, if you have any questions, by all means, go to a thing called the Bible Project. You can Google this and find it, and take as much time as you can to wade into as much as whatever it is that they have to offer. Um, because I think that with Tim's work, we will come to see that the Bible was written in a certain way and intended to be read in a certain way that we often don't do. And in the same way, I would say this, that the Bible reflects that our lives were intended to be written in a certain way and not read in another way.
Yeah.
We read our lives in a way that they were never meant to be read,
Hmm.
because we read our lives through a lens of shame, and we've been doing this since the beginning. And that's just one of the mechanisms that evil wants to use to shape and change who we are and to help us maintain our posture of fear and violence. But I just want to put that plug in, because when we talk about these primary areas of family and church and school, these are the areas where we don't just learn about the stories, we learn about how those stories are supposed to be told and retold and read and written and so forth and so on. And we end up misreading them, mistelling them, misinterpreting them, largely because we don't have the fundamentals.
I
And the
love
Bible
your
Project
excite.
is a great way.
Yeah, I love your excitement about this, and I can't wait to check it out. I've not spent any time in there yet, so I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you for letting us know about
Yeah.
that.
And so that's just a segue. It segues us right into this first story when we want to talk about our first families, that we are like that shame wants to operationalize itself in these very primal places where we come into the world. And in the book, we explore Eric's story. Eric is this high school senior who kind of walks in and says to his parents, "I'm not going to go to college. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not doing that." And by the way, this faith thing that you've been inculcating me with all these years, like, I don't want to have anything to do with that either. And his parents, Dominic and Joan, are like, they don't know what to do with this. And they find themselves in my office because he's upset. They called me, and I said, like, well, I don't have a conversation with Eric, and we do. And he starts to talk about his experience that is one in which, if you were to look at their family, there was nothing overtly painful or problematic about their family at first glance. Except that when you would talk with them about the nature of how people would kind of communicate, the one thing that you'd find is that this one phrase kept coming up over and over again. We only expect Eric and the rest of our kids to do their best.
Do their best. Yeah.
Just do their
Yeah.
best.
Which
Now,
seems like a benign statement. When you say it, it seems like, of course we want you to do your best. Just do your best. It's like you say that in order to take the pressure off a lot of
yeah,
times, right? right?
Yeah. We don't
Yeah,
expect you to get straight A's. If the
right.
best you can do is B's, okay, that like that, you're right. But the subtle associated message is, but we do expect you to do your best
At everything.
at everything.
Right.
And I remember being in college, and this psychology professor said, one of the least helpful things that parents can do is to say to their children, we don't expect perfection, we just expect you to do your best. With the implication being at everything. And of course, no one has the energy or time or capacity to do their best at everything.
Right.
We just can't do that.
Yeah.
It's just so hard to do that. And so for Eric, it became this like I got to do my best at everything, including faith and including school and all these things. And he eventually just kind of got sick of it because it wasn't making any sense. It wasn't helping. It wasn't making any sense for him. And so when he says, like, I'm done with this, of course, what this did was to raise all kinds of anxiety for both Dominic and Joan, his parents. And we come to discover that Eric had become like the receptacle for some trickle down effect of both Dominic and Joan's families and elements of their own stories that they had not really addressed. Dominic came from an anger ridden family of where his father was a raging alcoholic. And so we're always going to work pretty hard to keep, we're going to do the right thing to make sure that, chaos doesn't reign. And Joan had come from a family where her parents had divorced when she was 7, and the whole sense of just being anxious that somebody's going to leave, like always, somebody's going to leave, somebody's going to leave, somebody's going to leave. And so we're always making sure that we're just going to do the right thing to make sure that somebody doesn't leave. So everybody's working really hard to protect themselves against these potentially catastrophic outcomes. And so the way they kind of merge their stories together without, of course, knowing that this is what they're doing, and kind of like a kinder, gentler way to say this to our kids instead of being angry or making them anxious is to just say, we just expect you to do your best over and over and over again.
Right.
Until Eric's decision kind of pulled the curtain back on all this. And what they eventually came to discover, well, I mean, Eric, he became the front end of the plow, and he starts to plow a furrow because he's in my office doing work. And at one point I said, well, what would it be like for you? Is it okay if I shared some of these things with your family about, not all the details, but, your experience of them? And he was, not everybody would do this, but he was willing to do this. And I shared with them, like, this is the story. Like, it's the whole notion of, as it turns out, even though you're not asking perfection, that's exactly what the message is that you're sending, whether you know it or not. And this, of course, led then to our we got Joan to see a therapist. We got Dominic to see somebody because there was just all of this shame that is being kind of directed at Eric without anybody even knowing it. As we've said, evil is very subtle. It doesn't come at us, front on it obliquely, right? It just do your best.
Right.
And they were able to make headway in that and eventually able to speak with each other more vulnerably because, of course, for both Dominic and Joan, when they first started to talk about the realities of their stories, I mean, there was so much grief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Joan's anxiety is largely about her working to hold back, Lake Mead. Like,
Right.
like she's like the Hoover Dam having to hold back Lake Mead from all the fear that she has that somebody's going to leave if I don't do my best to make sure that everything is okay. We don't like obey God and do all the right things, cross the T's, dot the I's, and so forth and so on. We're going to do it with kindness, but we're still going to have to do that. And so as they were able to be more vulnerable with themselves, they could then be vulnerable with each other, Dominic and Joan. And as they started to do that, Eric started to report like a viscerally felt sense of like the air in the room, in the house is changing. And they became more open and willing to hear Eric talk about his own doubts, concerns, and cares. And they were able to validate that because they had their own. They're like, oh, yeah, now I'm less afraid to talk about the shame in my own life because I'm getting work done with that. And as their vulnerability, we've talked about these healing clouds of witnesses and the vulnerability that is necessary for shame to be healed. And they began to do this in their family. And interestingly enough, it changed over time, not overnight, but over time, it changed all of their ways of imagining Jesus. That Jesus was no longer someone who was saying to each of them, no, I love you. All I ask for you is just do your best. He was no longer asking that question. He was no longer making that statement. He was saying, I want you to tell me where you are. I want you to tell me what's hard. Now, it doesn't mean that I won't put demands on you. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to ask you to, pray for the people that you don't like. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to ask you to be curious about your consumption, be curious about your anxiety, be curious about these things. It doesn't mean that I'm going to not ask you to stop looking at porn. I'm going to place some demands on you, but those demands are the things that I place on you, not looking for you to do your best, but because I want you to allow me to love you. I want you to allow me to love you. And that's what's often so difficult for us. Shame won't let me let others love me. And so if this is where I begin in my home with this, it's not then surprising that, like, if you can imagine, like Dominic and Joan were taking Eric and his siblings off to church, and churches are populated with families who are just there to do their best. And that's what we all want to do. Like, we want to go to church, and the church becomes like a hospital, right? It's a hospital where we're all coming and we all are working really hard to be loving, kind people of the fruit of the Spirit of God. And we want to do our best at this.
Or at least look like we're doing our best at this.
At least look like I'm doing my best. That's right. I want to come and at least I want to look like I'm doing my best.
Pretend that we just didn't, my wife and I just didn't have that fight on the way to church.
Oh my gosh.
Walking with smiles on our face.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. But I love the picture of vulnerability within the family. It's not always an easy thing to do, I think, for parents, especially to, some of us, I think, want that vulnerability to be a one-way street where we want our kids to share everything that, that they're experiencing, but we don't necessarily want to share our, obviously you would want to do it age appropriately and all that kind of thing, but our stories where there's things that we're not proud of, where there's shame, and where there's, to share that with your kids is powerful, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We often tell parents that that one of the most important gifts that you can give to your kid is the gift of revealing yourself to them at developmentally appropriate moments.
Right.
I'm not going to say the same things to my 6-year-old that I would say to my 16 or 26 or 36-year-old child. I say different things to them, share different elements of my life. But as I do, the very act of doing it sends them the message that I'm not afraid of God being in this story with me, and I'm not afraid of being in your story with you. And they also hear that they don't have to be afraid of being in their own story. They're not going to be in their story by themselves.
Right.
This act of vulnerability disallows shame from continuing to build a fortress, not just within a single person, but within systems.
Yeah.
And so as we dismantle shame within the context of families, those families then go off to church and begin to populate churches in which the same kinds of things take place. We tell people that no system in the world exists apart from it being modeled off the family. Even church is modeled as a system from off the family, right? There's a head, right? If the head is a two, let's say it's a 2-parent, family unit for argument's sake. We know that that's not all families, but a 2-parent to the degree that that's, and then we have typically, if children come into the family, those children come in, you've got an oldest and then the next and the next and the next, you might, however many kids you have, and they have different stages of development and hierarchy and so forth and so on. And that's exactly what happens in any other system that we encounter. And so we then take, as we like to say, we take our families to church, we take our families to work, we take our families everywhere we go. The question is, to what degree have I done the work of allowing God to redeem the shame in my life, in my family, such that I don't repeat it in my workplace, that I don't repeat it in my church, that I don't end up like looking, because we go looking for work that looks like our family, whether we know it or not. This is what I mean when I say we take our families to work.
Right.
And so we then think about the church, the local church. We move from the family to the church, and one of the folks that I've worked with, his name's Brady, and he was a pastor of a young growing church. And Brady was one of these guys who was getting it done. I mean, he was the genuine article. I mean, uh, he wasn't there. He wasn't putting on a show. He the genuine article, and a guy who's serious about spiritual formation, serious about loving his congregation, but also worried about running out of gas when he wants to do his best.
Right.
And the pressure that he felt, like as the church started to flourish, very quickly, right? Things start to happen, and the evil one comes calling. And just like Jesus, who comes out of the water at his baptism, and like his ministry is before him, and then he heads into the desert. And the devil wants to invite him, as Jesus considers what is before him, the devil wants him to believe, wants him to, like, I want you to transcend who you were made to be as a human in order for you to get what you can get. And I want you to transcend who you were made to be, which is what we've been doing since Eden. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do that. And there's all these pressures that will come to Brady to now begin to transcend who he was made to be. He's made to be the pastor of a flock of people. And this happens because systems grow. And now you're not just the pastor of, 20 people or 150 people. Now you're the pastor of 1,500 people before you know it. Like Brady can't pastor 1,500 people. And so we construct systems. Before you know it, there's this pressure to, like, well, what are we going to do with 1,500? Now what are we going to do with, like, as these things happen. And as we talked about his story, his also was one in which there was this sense of pressure, and I'd asked him, so who are the people in your church whose job it is to care for you? And he's like so many pastors, like, I don't, that's my job. Like, it's a one-way street here. And yes, I do have a couple of, I've got elders whose ostensibly their job is to care for me, and that's true. And I said, well, so what is it like for you to consider telling them about the things that you're worried about? And of course, everything that gets conjured so quickly is this notion of, they're going to find out who I really am. I'll be out of a job.
Yeah, that'll tear everything down. Yeah.
We like to say that when we described our when we were in our series on trauma and trauma in the church, and we talked about hospital acquired infection.
Right.
This notion that the church is very much like a hospital, right, where we all come because we're sick, and then we're surprised why there are other people who are so unhealthy who are here. And but the thing is that pastors also need a place where they can be a patient.
Yeah.
And so the church as a hospital is difficult until and or unless, as a pastor, you also have the space to be vulnerable yourself. And so, Brady's story was one that was somewhat unusual in that he started to talk, he had a conversation with one and then a second elder that he felt particularly close to. And their bottom line was, hey, bring it on. Reminds me of a friend of mine who is the pastor of a church in Northern California. And this is a guy who also, not unlike Brady, took over the pastoral role of a church, and it continued to grow and grow and grow. And then they wanted to build a new building and so forth and so on. And he was feeling overwhelmed with all of the growth. What am I supposed to do? And he took a very short sabbatical. and went away. And, he made the mistake of going to hang out with, people like Dallas Willard, who, if our listeners know anything about Dallas Willard, know not any longer because he's passed away, but if you get in the room with Dallas Willard, like for 10 minutes, let alone for 2 weeks, you need to be prepared for things to be different by the time your visit with him is done. And this pastor was, he came back and he said, like, I realize that my mission is about formation of my people. My mission is not about growth of attendees or money or buildings or whatever. Like, my mission is about forming people into the image of Jesus. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to do that more slowly. We're going to have to divert funding to other things. And he was sure that when he came back from his sabbatical, that he was going to meet with his elders and he was going to say, here's where I am. Here's where I think we need to go. And he was sure that they were going to give him his pink slip. And oddly enough, to a person, they all said, we've been waiting for this. We're going to saddle up. And within 6 months, the church's attendance dropped by over a third, including some of their biggest donors, because they weren't able. I mean, like, kind of like the rich young ruler. Like, we are so committed to doing our best that we have a hard time being aware that my longing to do the work of beauty and goodness in the world is so easily and subtly hijacked by evil with shame that I forget that the mission of God is to change me into becoming his son, and to change you into his son, and to change Amy into his daughter. Like, this is what he's trying to do. The mission is not to be measured in terms of buildings and money and so forth, or attendance in that sense. And so this notion, what happened with Brady was that he began to, employ a lot of the work we've talked about, confessional communities here. And so he began to employ these particular tactics, that their mission was going to be to no longer allow evil to have a foothold by using shame in their congregation. And everything about the work that they began to do, not everybody was ready to do this. Like my friend in California, not everybody was ready to make this work. But they really took this on and took this seriously. And of course, it disrupts things. There are people who were not happy with Brady about this. There were people who thought that what he was doing was it was not the gospel. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. We're not about that. We're not about telling our stories more truly. We're about preaching the gospel.
Right.
As if those are different things.
Right.
And so those are but when we do this in our church family, when we have it in our family, in our church families, when we do the work of vulnerability, when we do the work of dismantling shame, we really create space. We are co-laboring with Jesus. We create space in which the Spirit comes in and starts to enable us to take the hard steps of serving our neighbors, being more generous, being kinder, living at a slower pace, and all those kinds of things. Because my pace necessarily has to be slower if I'm going to have the conversation with you about all my vulnerability. I can't just come in and spend an hour preaching on a text of 3 verses and expect that to be transformational all by itself in some kind of magical way. Of course, not diminishing the power of 3 verses of the Bible, but I think we get what we're talking about here.
Right.
And so we move then from family to the church, and then to this other extended area, this place where we spend most of our waking hours from the time we are about 4 years of age until the time most of us are about 17 or 18. Most of our daytime hours are spent in some kind of learning environment. And one of the things that I like to describe learning as a function of which in which we declare our vulnerability. To learn, in fact, is to say, I don't know things.
Right.
That's why I'm in school. It's not because of what I do know. It's because of what I don't know. And in fact, we would say that learning involves the incorporation of novel experience. Like I'm incorporating something that I didn't know yesterday. From the time that we're born, we come out of the uterus and we are now having to incorporate a new thing. And I need your help helping me interpret what this new thing is. And we do this pretty well by first, like children have very little difficulty with this. Young children have very little, like we're showing them, they're not worried about what they don't know. They're just learning new things. They're just like soaking it in, eating it up, learning new things. And so we're learning is a declaration of our vulnerability. Like kids, yes, they come, the teacher has to help them. Like they give them a nap when they're in kindergarten. They still take a nap. All these things, but children are incorporating novel experience. And they're doing so often with joy and curiosity. And then at some point, we start to make the turn, often around, now it's getting younger and younger, because we're seeing children at younger and younger ages with anxiety disorders. And I can assure you, it's not because there's an anxiety virus that has suddenly broken out here in Northern Virginia, but because at younger and younger ages, we begin to apply anxiety to the learning process. And anxiety begins to have more authority. You need to do well on this test so that you can get into this middle school, so that you can get into this high school of your choice, so that you can go to the college of your choice, or whatever the thing is. Like that's the thing here in Northern Virginia for many, many people. Instead of cultivating a culture of curiosity. And this is where we come back to like the fundamental elements of all learning, whether it's in family or church or in school, is this question of being known. If I'm the child, if I'm being known by my teacher is aware that I don't know things. My teacher's offering me things. My teacher wants to inculcate this. My teacher wants me to master the material. And so there's going to be a way for me to do that. But the issue is not about cracking the whip to get me to be able to spit something out on a test. The issue is, am I able to become more of who I was, more than who I was 3 months ago? And not just because I happen to have a boatload of facts in my head that I didn't have then. Am I becoming more and more of the person that I really, really want to be? But that process requires that somebody else is giving me the experience of being known. I learned that in my family. That's what church is about, right? I come because I need the experience of being known by God. I don't go just so that I can know about God. I have to have the experience of being known by God because I'm just so aware of what I need, often even what I don't need. And so we talked about cultivating a culture of curiosity creates the opportunity for learning to become that notion of fearlessly discovering what I don't know. I'm reminded of a consultation I did with a school in the Northeast, and it was a school that was committed to serving underserved populations, and the teachers were committed and people of great integrity and working really hard. But part of the issue was, of course, teachers depend upon the families of children, the parents of children, to supplement and help support whatever it is that they're actually doing in school. And so there are lots of things that they would have for parents to help the children do. And these were families that didn't always have the kinds of resources that other more affluent families would have. And so the teachers would worry not just for their kids because the kids' parents weren't kind of capable always, but when those parents were not capable, the teachers would then worry that because of that, I need to bring more to the table as the teacher to make this happen. Now, as often happens in institutions that are committed to the next right, good, beautiful thing, these were teachers who teachers of great conviction, great integrity, and they worried that they weren't doing their job well enough, because we're here on a mission with and for God. It's a Christian school, with and for God in this community. And in this respect, we end up then saying, oh my goodness, I'm doing all this pressure, but I don't say any of this. Now, what was interesting was I spent 2 days with these folks. And in the middle of all this, I'm having individual conversations with these teachers, and I'm asking, like, well, so what happens when you say this in the faculty meetings? Oh, I wouldn't say that because I'm too worried about what they're going to think. And before you know it, these teachers are naming these things in their community, in their group. And of course, one teacher says, oh, and they realize like they're not by themselves. Like everybody's thinking this. Everybody's worried about this. But the notion of being vulnerable in that space, they're like, oh my gosh, like it's like I'm the student in the classroom who's acknowledging that I don't know. That's the truth. Like, I don't know. That's why I'm in school. It's not because of what I worry that I go to school to demonstrate to you what I know. When that's not why I'm there. I'm there because I don't know things. And so discovering what I don't know. And then, the work of Carol Dweck, I think, is really instructive for this in this. Carol Dweck is this psychologist. We've probably talked about her before. That
We have, yeah.
The book Mindset Research. And this notion that paying attention to hard work as much as, if not more so, than the work being accomplished.
I love this.
Yeah. And this notion that when our children are working hard, that we can say to them, if they do well or if they don't do well, like just acknowledging how hard the work is that they're doing, to acknowledge this. I don't know if I've told this story before or not, that when our son was in a math class when he was in high school, and we went to the back to school night, we met with this math teacher in the room, and there were only about like 8 or 10 students in this class, and this math teacher said, I've never been in a meeting like this. I think our son was a junior, and he's in this group of guys. It was an all boys school. In this group of guys who are all really good students, and they're all used to getting A's. And have I told this story before?
No, I don't think
Yeah.
so.
And so the parents are sitting around, and this teacher says to us, the first thing that he says to us, it just oh gosh, it still gets me when he says, first thing I want to tell you is, I love your boys. Like, what high school teacher tells the parents, I love your boys? They mean the world to me. And the second thing I want to tell you is this. Your boys are used to doing really well in school. They work hard, and they rightly are, awarded for it. He said, but it's very likely that your boys are not going to get A's in this class. And I've told them that. And I've told them, you're not going to get A's, not because I'm too hard of a teacher. You're not going to get A's because you're not smart enough, because you're not working hard enough. He said, you're not going to get A's because math is really hard. In fact, it's harder than you have any idea that it is, the kind of math we're going to do. And he would tell them this over and over again. And, these boys didn't like to get B's.
Sure.
Right. Let alone C's. Like they want the A. And I remember feeling, oh my gosh, I could study with this guy. I could work for this guy. My son can live with this guy for the rest of his life. Because this is a guy who's telling the truth about the world. That the world is really hard. But your work that is effective, I can draw you into it and continue to do it, because we're not going to do this by ourselves. We're going to do this together. And that's really essentially what Carol Dweck's work really proposed. And then we go on to this, for our listeners, Ellen Langer, Langer, Ellen Langer is a psychologist, and she's done a lot of work around the question of mindful learning. And this whole notion that answers to questions are so much more available to, we are much more likely to be curious if we see answers as being possibilities rather than certainty. We want to have all the answers laid out there to check all the boxes. And this is another thing that shame wants to do. Shame wants us to believe that we can and should be certain about everything in life, or as much as life as we can be. And we do this in order to regulate our fear, in order to regulate the possibility that I will be ashamed. And if I can be certain, that's the closest step. That if I know all that can be known, then I don't need you. I get to be like God.
Yeah, I remember once when my kids were little, my daughter looked at me and she said, "Dad, do you know everything yet?" Which I said, "Of course."
Well, I wonder, she's how old now?
Well, she's 22 now, so yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I wonder when she's going to find out that that's, maybe not
I
quite
think
true. I wonder,
I think that ship
you think,
sailed about
wait, do you think she's going to have to wait until she's 30?
no, I think it was probably about 3 when they figured it out. I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to hide it. Mm.
Well, for all these things, I think what we're really trying to say is that shame tries to lock us into these boxes where we try to know as much as we can know, wherein learning is really about vulnerably expanding our comfort and confidence and kind of dancing with the world, incorporating the world and being with the world, acknowledging that there are things that I don't know. And I'm really stewarding that relationship. And I'm not trying to control it or consume it or be certain about it. And in our application for today, I just want us to think about this. That I want us, as you're able to consider each of the three primary nurturing communities we've discussed in terms of your own story, whether that's your family, whether that's the church, or whether the school in which and if you're a teacher listening to this, you're in that system. And just be curious about where and how were you encouraged to be curious rather than needing to be certain? Encouraged to be vulnerable instead of needing to be impregnable and of all knowledge. Where and how did shame play a role in dominating your learning process, as it were? And how do you wish those experiences had been different? And if you're now in the business of, if you're a parent, if you're working in a church, if you're in education, if you're now stewarding children and their learning experiences, how can you help cultivate an environment of greater curiosity? Consider ways in which you can put Carol Dweck's or Ellen Langer's work to work for you in learning to praise hard work as much as you do accomplishment, and to being open and curious about the answers to questions as we are certain about those answers. And then, of course, as always, consider sharing this with someone that you trust. Again, I want to just circle back and say all this begins with this question of, in what story do we believe we're living?
Mm.
And back, citing our friend Tim Mackey and the Bible Project as a way for us to once again be reminded that it is in these primal places where we learn our first stories, and we want to know that we are learning them the way they are intended to be told and to be heard, so that we can do the same thing about our own stories themselves.
Great. Thank you, Curt. Encourage everybody to take advantage of the application for this week. And next week, we will be on the final chapter of the book. So be sure to read ahead for next week. And until then, Curt, I love you. It's great being with you.
Right on, man. Love you too. Till next time.
Till next time. And if you are watching on YouTube, Amy's going to be joining us now.
That was great.
Thanks.
Good.
I love your sweater. I love your sweater.
Thank you. It's new. Thank you.
It's cool.
I think blue works for me. Maybe.
Thank you for telling me that it's blue.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. What color did you think it was? I forgot about.
Well, I thought it was. I thought it was, but then I thought, man, she might say it's lavender, or she might say it's some kind of like purple thing that I can't.
It was baby blue.
You could wear that sweater to do holy work.
That's good.
Okay,
I've got like a dozen T-shirts I could do that with too.
Yes.
Holy work.
Yeah.
I was thinking, on a funny note, the Bible Project, because the idea that we're reading the Bible incorrectly. I thought, I have tried to read through the Bible in a year, probably 22 times, and I've never done it. And I'm like, Now I can do it right. I can.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't spend a year reading it wrong.
Just a quick thing that
Yeah.
has immediate application to what we're talking about. One of so Tim offers a couple of practical suggestions for how we can begin to enter into reading the Bible differently. And one thing that he suggests, he said, most Christians engage the Bible by either their own kind of like private reading of it. They'll have devotions, 20 minutes a day, or maybe something like that, and they're reading a few verses at a time, or they encounter it in their places of worship, church, right? It's a sermon, right? But he said, even if you listen to a sermon that's anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, he says, most of what you're hearing is not the scripture. You're hearing, 4 minutes of scripture, and then you're hearing the rest about some exposition of the scripture. He said, one of the ways to begin to practice reading the Bible the way the Bible was written and the way those who wrote the Bible would have read the Bible, he said, would be to plan on, 2 or 3 times a week, plan on reading the Bible for an hour. Sit down and take a chunk and just read as much, read the entire Gospel of Mark, and then read it again, and then read it again. Or take the first 11 chapters of Genesis and just read them straight through, large chunks of the scripture.
Or Revelations.
And then he says, and the other thing to do, which I thought was really cool, I heard that comment about Revelation, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is, he said, think about gathering some friends and spend an evening, plan on, you're going to read the Bible out loud with each other. And so you're going to get your group of friends and you're going to read the Gospel of Mark. And you're just going to read the whole thing straight through in the course of the evening. And that whole notion of it being orally read. So the first thing is that you're reading large chunks of it, and then you're reading it to each other. And here's what struck me about that. Oh my gosh. You get a text from somebody. And you have the option of saying I'll text them later. How infrequently anymore when somebody texts us do we just call them? No, because the text gives me much more control over things, and I don't have to enter into a conversation with them. I mean, perhaps been on the receiving end of this on a couple of occasions. You have too, Amy. I just call you.
I'm hey, wait a minute. I texted you.
Putting up with it. I can't do this. I can't do this now. I'm just going to call you. And Pat never answers. And so that's not true. Okay. Yeah. So, but this notion that we just have these kind of fly by night, this passing oblique connection with each other.
Right.
And in the same way, this is kind of what evil counts on. Evil counts on me. You ask me, how am I doing? I say, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good. It's
just this very quick, superficial interaction, which is kind of like reading my Bible for 20 minutes in the morning, reading a certain section of it. A very, like 10 verses in the first chapter of Mark or whatever. But the whole point being that if I were to read large swaths of it, or if I were to gather my friends and say, we're going to read the entire book of Mark together out loud, it's like the three of us sitting down and having 90 minutes together where we are going to tell our stories at length and in depth. And it is in the when you only get snippets of me, you don't really get the story of me as it really is. And when we do this with the Bible, we don't get the story as it really is, nor as it was intended to be gotten. And in that sense, I'm like, oh my gosh, even the way the Bible is written is a reflection of and an invitation to how God also wants me to live my life with you.
Yeah.
I don't want you to be a collection of snippets that I get, 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. I don't just want the phone call. I want coffee, on the porch for 2 hours.
So, yeah. That's
so I just understand it. I just want to let you know flights are cheap to the East Coast these days. So,
I got to get on that.
All right. Okay. That's a lot of yapping. Sorry.
No, that was good. Okay. The thing that really struck me. Okay. Carol Dweck. And so I was thinking as you guys were talking, so the idea as our greatest purpose and our greatest joy is to create beauty. And so that is a placeholder. Then like the idea of, I mean, the pressure to get it right is so debilitating, or can be so debilitating. And then like A for effort and a participation award, it's always like, really? That's what I get, is a participation award. But it's like but it's like, okay, so what I've learned, and it took me a long time.
How'd Amy do? Well, I'm pretty sure her heart
Well,
was
she
beating in
showed up.
class.
She showed up.
She stayed upright in her chair.
She was on time.
Ah,
But what I've learned is like, even it took me a long time to, if I have a project, and like now the more that I'm embarking on scary and exciting and life-giving things, it's like, okay, I don't know. And if I tell myself I need to spend an hour on this, then it is vastly different than if I tell myself I need to do this, I need to accomplish this task. Because then accomplish this task, there is so much pressure to get it done.
Got it. Yeah.
And if I spend an hour, it's like I can just feel the pressure lift. And it's like, and then we accidentally create beauty and goodness because, but there, I want to read one line because I'll misquote it, but it's where it's on page 164. And I'm going to start in the middle of a sentence, but it's talking about relieving the pressure, and it enables the students to freely do their work and turn their attention away from failure and shame. And it's like, we can't not create beauty and goodness.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. I think also this idea of acknowledging someone's hard work. Yes, when someone does really well, we want to say, you did really well, obviously, you know, that kind of, but that's not really saying that you see them and you know them as much as when you see them toiling and you recognize that to them, that person can then feel more known than just being, you know, praised and acknowledged for what they accomplished.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and you see this all the time with people who are really gifted, where in which, you know, they're gifted, and so, you know, they do well, and then it doesn't feel like they're putting in much effort. And there is a sense in which the praise that they get for the accomplishment, they intuitively get that there's something off about this. That I'm getting praise for something that really didn't, you know, if I've got a photographic memory and I'm just making straight A's, I'm able to do that. And somebody says, "Oh my gosh, you're just so smart. You're like, you know, like, because what we really are longing for is connection when it's hard for us to do the work."
Yeah.
You know, I think, I don't know if we talked about this before, but in Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, he has a chapter where it's titled something like, you wouldn't wish dyslexia on your children, or would you? And he cites all of these different people who, because they had to overcome something in their youth and work that much harder, were that much more successful later on in life than those people who, like you said, who are necessarily just gifted and can skate through.
Well, and it's the hard work that we have control over, right? We have less control over what we actually accomplish. Like
my high school senior just the other day said, and she works really hard, and she has overcome some things, as you both know. And she said the other day, you know, getting good grades is not that difficult. It's all about just working really hard.
Yeah.
It's just working really hard.
Listen to that. Wow.
Yeah.
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 And she does work really, really hard. And
Yeah.
I need to acknowledge that probably more than I do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not like she doesn't see hard work in her house.
Right.
Because I mean, like, okay, so for our viewing audience now, and also for our listener, but for our viewing audience, we started this recording, and we did a little advertising spot for something, but we didn't have it mapped out ahead of time, and so we were just kind of doing this on the fly, and we were all, I mean, I was kind of like you were leading that charge. And you started it a couple of times, and each time, like, you paused, and I'm like, okay, we're not getting this exactly the way Pepper wants it. And then you paused, then you waited, and you started again, so forth. And like as we said before, I was just like watching in amazement, because I felt like I was watching a master craftsman not be perfect the very first time he did it.
Mm-hmm.
But I was watching a master craftsman when he recognized, no, I don't like that. Pause. We're going to come back and do that work again, and do that work again, comfortably, confidently, just waiting. And in my head, I'm thinking, like, this is what 30 years worth of work,
working hard,
of hard work does. It doesn't create somebody who's always perfect all the time. It creates someone who, when things aren't exactly what he wants them to do, with comfort and confidence, he pauses and then starts again.
Yeah.
And then starts again. And then eventually, like, we're off and running.
Mm-hmm.
And it was inspiring. I'm making this up at all. Like, it was inspiring to be in those first, like, whatever, 60 seconds or whatever it was that we were kind of, getting the rocket off the launch pad to do the spot.
Hour and a half.
Wow. Okay.
I kid.
Okay. Amy is in the house.
Hey, she's fair game now. That's all I
Oh,
got
I'm
to say.
telling you.
Oh yeah, because before I was you both
were always-
tempered yourself. Yeah.
You all, to our viewing audience, like, you might be aware that we've got a little thing coming up here in October, and
Yes, we
we're all going to
do.
be there. We're all going to be there, and Amy's going to be there, and, like, we are going to have, like, you never have so much fun at somebody's expense like you do at a live show.
That's right. That's right. Especially in the beginning when she's not allowed to talk.
I know, it's going to be so awesome.
I haven't booked my flight yet. Yeah.
That's right. No,
But it's true, Curt, to your point, like, Pep, your kids, they see the hard work, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
you model that.
Yeah.
Thank
Right
you.
You're a
on.
model.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
This was great.
Thanks for
That's
this.
great.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time
See you
around.
next week.
Next time.
All right.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at Being Known Pod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.